Glad to be back here. Glad to be back in Chicago, where I'm actually from. So I'm Nate Blair. I'm general counsel at Hi-Rez Studios and Skillshot Media. Skillshot Media is the esports development and publishing company that we started a couple of years ago. So that's kind of my background. Before that, practicing in big law for a long time at Fuller & Gardner, where I was senior counsel, and it's the standard disclaimer, not legal advice, not any of those parties' views. Same thing that we also point out. So when Ross asked me things to talk about, I said, well, there's a bunch of different sort of ways that you license your IP, and I can talk about some of those things. And he said, great, let's talk about all of those. Put that in your presentation. And I said, am I the only person talking for 6 hours? So we're not going to do all of that, but there are a lot of different ways that you can license your IP. Obviously, when we're talking about licenses in video games, we've got inbound licenses, we've got outbound licenses. I'm mostly going to talk here really about a general overview with respect to publishing agreements, but there are lots of other types of things. So you will have tools, etc., that you will use in developing your game, of course. What will come up a little bit more and what we're going to talk about here, we do have lots of different ways in which you could have inbound licenses of what we refer to as sort of soft IP, characters. You could have a full movie that you're making into a video game. You could have, IP from, a celebrity's likeness. A lot of the games with esports will do, skins for some of the teams, things like that. Publishing agreements and development agreements. I'm going to talk a little bit kind of about both of them, and there I'm really talking about sort of the distinction of, are you publishing, is the agreement for a developer to have a separate publisher publish that developer's game, or is that developer really sort of a work-for-hire shop that is making a game for the publisher? So I'm putting that both a little bit in the category of inbound and outbound licenses. Obviously in 2018, there's an awful lot of other ways that you can monetize your video games. Media rights deals for esports, tournament licenses for esports being some important ones. If we do have time, maybe we'll go in a little bit to some of those things. And there are other things like fan licenses, community licenses, and obviously we talked just a little bit about those in the last presentation. So publishing agreements. So there's obviously a few different ways that somebody could be publishing for you. There are platforms, of course, console, mobile, Steam. You've got competitors to Steam that are coming out there, Discord, Google. You could also be doing it, though, with respect to specific territories. Notably here, you have China, which largest gaming country in the world, and you can't publish there unless you are licensed by the government. So not only is it sort of a cultural difference there in terms of sort of what video games are expected to look like and what video games will sell well, but you just can't do it. And if you follow the news at all with respect to China over the last 9 months or so, you actually can't do it if you are registered in China. So hopefully that will end before too long, but certainly we'll be looking at a good amount, I think, of pent-up demand in China in terms of new titles for people to play. You could also have a global publisher, and a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to relate to all of these, but I am definitely going to talk about sort of the global publisher, and I know that there's always sort of kind of a mix of these things in terms of whether or not people are attorneys, whether or not they're publishers, and obviously we have an online audience as well. So we're going to definitely sort of talk about some of the ways in which a smaller developer may hook up with a publisher, giving them rights to publish in all of these various ways. So a few pre-contract things we'll talk about, why a publisher and some due diligence. So there's a lot of advantages with hooking up with a publisher. Obviously with some of those, publishers that have a monopoly, either on their own console on their own platform, on their own territory? On some level, the answer is pretty obvious. If you don't do it, well, you have no access to Xbox players unless you go through Microsoft. But here I'm more talking about the advantages of choosing a global publisher for you. So publishers can be invaluable resources. If you are a small developer, they're going to have knowledge that you may not have. Even if you are a larger developer, it's just a third person's perspective, right? Nobody is ever so big that they know everything, save perhaps Tencent, but everybody else, you can always be learning, of course, from what everybody else is doing. A publisher is going to provide you with connections you may not be able to have. If you are a small developer, you may have a hard time, getting onto a certain platform, and a larger publisher may be able to open those doors for you. Traditional areas that they're, of course, going to be strong in that you may not be as a developer, marketing strategy, they may have marketing dollars, they've got lots of people, they've got lots of back-end resources. One way that you should think about if you are a smaller developer and you're just getting started, you may really want to think about, do I really want to take all those things on? Or do I want to essentially outsource all of that publishing, right? If I just want to make my game, maybe that's all I want to do. I just want to make a great game and I want it to be out there, and of course I want that game to be financially successful, but maybe I don't want to hire up a marketing team. Maybe I don't want to hire up a back-end platform team. And I think we're probably going to see, even more of that potentially as you start having large tech companies offering essentially platform in a box, and that's going to be, a way that smaller companies really can leverage that outsourcing of everything other than just their game design. So due diligence, obviously before you actually choose a publisher, there's a lot of things you want to be thinking about. A relationship between the publisher and the developer really is sort of a marriage. You're going to be working together a lot. You're going to hopefully be working together for a long time. And you really want to think about, does this work well for both of us on a micro level, on a macro level? Do they make the types of games that you make, right? Is their business model just totally different from what you're looking to do? If they are a publisher who, really doesn't have a whole lot of experience with games as a service, and you are looking to do games as a service, well, that may not be a great fit. Obviously the converse as well. Do they have experience with the sort of games that you make, right? Not just the business model, but also just those types of games. If they've never really done any mobile games, right? Are they just looking to use you as a guinea pig for them to start learning about mobile games? And even if they're not, right? I mean, you want to think about, do they have the experience that's going to really maximize that relationship and maximize your game's chance for success? How experienced they are, how successful they've been. Do they have those sort of extras that you may want? So in 2018, there's so many ways that you can not just monetize your game, but in so many ways that you can create that feedback loop with your audience, right? So, we talked a little bit beforehand, Steve had talked a little bit beforehand in the prior presentation about the importance of having the ability to permit your users to stream your game. And, that's a great way to get free marketing. It's a great way to, both attract and retain your user base. And so you want to think about that, and an important part of that is esports, right? Do they have those esports connections? Do they have those influencer connections? Do they have those capacities to do those things? That may not be relevant to every game, but depending on what type of game you're doing, you want to make sure they've got those things. You want to think about their style, their image, right? If you are using a global publisher, their image, their style is very possibly going to be more important than yours. That's going to almost become your game's image, perhaps. And they may not necessarily have the same sort of, attitude that you do towards things. I don't work at either of those companies. I can't really speak to anything that happened behind the scenes, but this isn't just a small company thing. Think of somebody like Disney and EA, right? And the controversy over Battlefield. What did Disney feel about how that was reflecting upon Disney? You've got a company that wants to present itself as extremely family friendly, right? Extremely good to their consumers, and all of a sudden, they've got their marquee IP, embroiled in this thing that perhaps they're not very happy about. So you want to think about those sorts of things. How much do they want you? I mean, there are definitely publishers out there that are very successful and could be great partners for you, but they have limits to their resources as well. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. They have limits to their resources as well. So you want to think about in terms of that, right? I mean, are they really going to be able to make a priority of you? And that can be difficult, of course, to tell, but it's definitely something you want to be thinking about. And by the way, as long as I'm there, I will throw out, so at times I'm going to be talking a decent amount, I think, sort of from the developer's perspective. And that's going to necessarily, I'm going to talk a little bit about you as a developer, things you need to think about in terms of protecting yourself, maximizing your chance for success. I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to badmouth publishers. Publishers are, of course, wanting the best for those developers, but you need to think as well that, of course, like I said, they have limits to their resources. They have their own needs, etc. So you do want to be thinking about it from your perspective, not just theirs. Obviously, you could have very different visions for the game, and that's a very important thing that you need to be thinking about. And of course, the business terms that they're offering, I put them last, not because they're least important, but because the other things are sort of, I think at times people forget about them because, there's this rush to, hey, these guys are offering us, $3 million to make our game, wow, that's fantastic. Like, you need to think about, all these other things as well. And so, without further ado, let's jump into the contract. Obviously, if you are a developer, this is one of the most important decisions you're going to make. This is going to have an awful lot of tools and protections that you need to ensure the best for your game, for your users, for your employees, for your shareholders. So, starting out, I just want to talk a little bit about some of just the very, basic rights that you're granting. And at some level, this may seem pretty basic, but it's essential. And you definitely will see clients that get themselves in a lot of trouble because they don't really think about these things, and they don't get them drafted as precisely as they should be. At the back, I'll talk a little bit about some boilerplate sort of things, but I'll kind of highlight up front here. The attorneys in the room, will know this, but those who aren't attorneys, or even for the attorneys, it's a good reminder. In the U.S. and in a lot of other jurisdictions, we have this concept that plays out in contracts called the merger clause. Essentially, it's a way to address the parole evidence rule, and you have this problem of, hey, that's all great that somebody promised me something right up until the time that it's not in the contract. And that's all great that we all thought that what we were doing was just giving you the rights to do our game in English, until we realized that nobody wrote the word English in the contract. So you want to be thinking about these things, and you need to be ensuring that they are carefully spelled out in the contract. These are extremely important rights, and if you get them wrong, you've got a problem. So precision is absolutely key here. You've got to make sure you have it down. What is the territory? Is it China? Or is it all of China? Is it Hong Kong? Is it Taiwan? Is it Macau? It's not enough maybe to just say China, right? Is it enough to say, LATAM? Is it enough to say Europe? Is Europe including the UK right now? So you want to be thinking very carefully about that. You want to think very careful, what rights are granted, for how long those rights are granted. What rights go beyond the termination of the contract, because some of them are going to. You need to be thinking about what medias you're granting. You need to be thinking about the fact that medias out there, new medias are going to be created, right? And the new medias, the current medias that are out there are very possibly going to converge. Are we going to have a big distinction right now between mobile and PC and console in the future? Well, there are certainly a lot of people that think that we won't. And then, even amongst people who think that there might not be, there's a lot of debate in terms of how long those distinctions will play out. So you need to be thinking about those things, and you want to be very careful about how you are drafting them in, and you need to be thinking about negotiating them appropriately. So publisher obligations, yeah.
Sorry, just on the last slide. Any thoughts on how game streaming services are going to affect the rights granted in the future?
Well, I think that it's likely to have an effect. I think it's a good question. I think that, when it comes down to it, people are just going to have to, you're going to probably have some fights because there's not going to be contracts that accounted for that. One of the tools you will have, of course, is there's going to be some people who are going to have the clout that are going to be able to, at the end of the day, push back against somebody that is claiming that they gave those rights to, and that maybe they don't have the contractual way to do it. But at the end of the day, they can bring enough pressure to bear, that publisher is going to have problems getting other games if they don't. Sometimes it's going to have to kind of play out that way. But in terms of, I'm not sure exactly how people are tending to deal with it a whole lot in terms of contracts. Part of that I think is also just a function of we tend to be always fighting the last war. And, as attorneys, like most people, we're not necessarily as great as we'd love to be as far as predicting the future. Yeah, I'm not seeing a ton in terms of what people do or talking with people that are doing a whole lot on that issue. But I think it's a great point. Publisher obligations, marketing the game, marketing strategy. These are pretty basic things that I'm sure that you guys are all thinking of in terms of the publisher that you're using. But you want to think a little bit about it in terms of, and we'll talk a little bit more in terms of marketing more specifically in a moment. You want to think about it in terms of support. One of the most important jobs that they're going to have is going to be, helping you out both from a technical support standpoint, from a customer support standpoint, typically. Live ops are a very large cost, and you don't want to underestimate it. And you want to be thinking about ensuring that they're going to give you good support. Best efforts is probably be hard for most people to push for. Perhaps a little more realistically, something like parity to the publisher's other games. But a lot of that is going to come down to really two things. I mean, it's going to come down to the leverage-related things of how badly do they want your game, how successful does your game look for them, and how successful does your game continue to be for them in practice, even forgetting about the contract. That's probably going to be sort of that biggest driver. In terms of, what you can get them to agree to in terms of support and contract. The global publisher, if you're really going that route, especially is going to be pretty heavily involved in a lot of product development decisions, everything to, what if you are a game as a service, what content you're making for sale, because that's going to tie in very closely to those marketing decisions. So financing. So obviously one of the great reasons to work with a publisher is to get financing. If you are a developer and you need money, this might be the only way that you can realistically get your game done. Or it may just be a way for you to mitigate some of your risk rather than you financing more of your game yourself. you're getting somebody else to get you funds that you can put into your game. Obviously, you are going to have a harder time getting development money if you have no track record. You're going to have a harder time if you are if the further along you get with your game, the more likely it is that publishers are going to want to invest money in you. They have a stronger sense of what it is they're investing in, and they've got a stronger sense of what your burn rate is looking like. They have a much better ability to actually realistically tell whether or not, hey, if I give you $1 million, is that really going to get you to the finish line, or is that just some number you randomly came up with, and after I've invested $1 million, I'm not getting a dime back unless I give you another $1 million. So where you are in development is going to have definitely an impact there, as well as your track record, et cetera. And again, of course, how badly they want your game, and also whether or not you are able to leverage other publishers against them. If you're able to go to events like E3 and things like that, you may have the opportunity, if you have some of the right connections, et cetera, you might be able to get into a situation where you are in a little bit of a bidding war and getting publishers to offer you different things. But again, that kind of goes back to what you're selling. Publisher advances. So there's a couple different ways someone can give you development money. One, they could just flat out give you money towards developing it, but probably more realistically, they're going to give you an advance against your royalties. In any way that they're giving you money, they're probably going to want exclusivity for some sort of time period. Advances are frequently non-refundable, but not always. So definitely be willing to negotiate on that point. Typically, these are going to be recouped first, but again, this is negotiable. This is going to go back a little bit to some of those questions of, where are you in your product development pipeline, and can you convince them that enough that, they have to have your game, and that game is either not coming to them or just not coming to market, period, without them giving you money in advance, but also giving you a sufficient repayment schedule that is realistic for you to continue making content for that game. Especially if you are doing a game as a service game as opposed to, a premium ship it and forget it style game, it is important to the publisher, same as it is to the developer, that developer continue to be able to, keep the lights on, keep their devs at their desks and working. I'm not saying that this will be an easy get for you as a developer, but it is something that, for a small developer, you should be thinking about. Minimum guarantees. Well, actually, I'm going to jump ahead to that last point there about the flywheel. So, developing games in an ideal world, right? Each game is going to really provide you with the income that you need to fund your next game, right? It's going to, in a game as a service model, it's going to fund your ability to keep making additional content in that game that you keep putting out. Thinking about how the money you get from the publisher fits into your overall finance picture is a critical thing, and especially for very small publishers that may not have a very large management team and may not have people with an awful lot of finance experience, that may be something that they're not paying as much attention to as they should. And you as an attorney really can be an asset to them by helping them think through some of those things about their finance management. How is the deal that we are striking here going to fit into the rest of our plans for funding our development? Minimum guarantees are another way to kind of get some financing support. It also could be a way to help push the publisher to give you good support in all those various ways that you want. Royalties. So, gross revenue is possible. It's a little bit uncommon. Much more likely you're going to be getting net revenues. Remember, one thing is that when you are going to go on specific platforms, that platform is also going to be taking out its cut. So before the global publisher, if that's what you're negotiating with at the time, that 30% Apple is coming out before you even get to the stage of what are the publisher and the developer going to be splitting up. Deductions are something you want to pay careful attention to. Publishers, of course, are going to be trying to kind of borrow a lot from, say, the film industry and look to deduct a crazy amount of things that they really can. It tends not to be quite so bad in the video game space, but you do want to be thinking about this. Returns are probably not quite as big of a thing as they used to be as we move increasingly to the online space, but you want to be thinking about things like how much can they subtract out. Caps on your deductions are a very common thing. That's something to think about and to push for. You want to be thinking about making sure they're not deducting out overhead. You'll definitely see people that will push forward a contract, and you look at these deductions, you're just sort of like, this is overhead. What's next? Am I supposed to be getting a deduction for your rent? For your electricity? So you want to think about, making sure the things that they're deducting out are really appropriate deductions. Going back a little bit to my point about, the timing of your finances and the flywheel, you want to be thinking about when you are paid. Again, you may not have, the leverage here. If you're dealing with Sony, well, Sony very possibly is going to try and say, well, we're going to pay you once a quarter and we're going to pay you, net 60, net 90. And all of a sudden, that dollar you make on March 1st, you are not getting in your pocket until November 30th. Did I do that math right? A long time later. So you need to be thinking about that. On a small budget, that could have an enormous impact in terms of your ability to keep going. So I'm not telling you that you as a small developer, or maybe even you as a medium developer, are going to be able to tell Sony, no, I'm not going to accept, being paid 5 months, after I receive something. But you definitely need to be thinking about it in terms of your planning, and certainly it is something to think about where you can. I used to do a lot of finance work, and I'll tell you what this basically is just a finance trick of them forcing you to loan them your working capital. That's all it is, right? If they gobble up enough people's funding there, well, I just got 5 months of working capital for free. So again, I'm not saying you're necessarily going to be able to have the leverage to fix that, but you want to think about that in terms of how it will impact what you are doing. You should have an audit right. A lot of times, the contract you'll first get from the publisher, it's not going to have that in there. A lot of times, if you advance your own back, perhaps a larger publisher might just say, okay, fine, you asked for it, so I'll give you the audit right, but it's not going to be yours, it's going to be this one. And they'll put forward what their legal team has come up with, but you got to make sure that you have one. At the end of the day, it's not that publishers are bad people, but mistakes happen, right? And you need to be able to assure yourself that you have a way to figure out what's going on with this accounting without calling up somebody like Steven and starting a lawsuit. You need to have a way to do it. It's a very basic thing. Anybody should give it to you.
Another thing that I've commonly seen on that is if the difference in what the audit produces is over X percent, like 5%, then the publisher covers the cost of the audit.
Yep, definitely. That's a very common thing, and it can be a little bit negotiable in terms of exactly what it is. I mean, anywhere 2% to 10%, I think is decently common. 5%, I think I probably see most commonly. I agree on that. And that concept there really is, so I'll restate it a little bit, just make sure people at home can hear, sort of thing. Really there, it's typically the audit is going to be at the expense of whoever is asking for the audit. So, in this case, it would typically be the developer. However, you would frequently have a provision that essentially says, hey, if you paid me, by more than 5% off what you should have been paying me, then you also have to cover the cost of my audit. Otherwise, it really is the case below that It's just sort of what the market bears, that you're probably going to be, nevertheless, that they're going to have to pay you that 4% below, what they were supposed to have paid you. They're not going to cover the cost of your audit as a general matter. Yeah.
How frequently, and from your experience, do developers actually exercise this audit right?
Pretty rare.
I can say for Gearbox software, every time. We have a window and we exercise it every time.
I think company practices are going to differ. I think it's also going to be just a reflection of realistically, somebody who's a little bit bigger, they've got resources, right? They can do some of that themselves. If you're a small developer, if you really, until you've reached the point that you think something is actually off there, it could be a meaningful cost, right? If you don't have somebody with those skills, you have to now go hire somebody externally, right? And so now, that point of sort of like that 5%, you're sort of starting to make kind of like a little bit of a bet, right? Like, is it going to be enough to cover what my costs of going to keep them honest were? And so for a very small developer, that's a tough thing. I completely agree. I mean, there are definitely companies that do it very routinely, and I think the larger you are, the much more likely you are to be doing that. For small developers, it is a hard thing to be doing. That said, I'm not in any way suggesting that you shouldn't, and you should also recognize that your audit right is usually going to be limited by various time periods, right? And so you are very possibly waiving those audit rights. There's even some publishing agreements where you would be waiving the right to the royalty fees that you were supposed to be paid because you didn't raise that objection by a certain time period. So you are definitely taking a gamble in not doing it, but like exercising any other legal rights, there is a cost in doing it, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'll just add to that. On the publisher side of things, you also potentially have audit risk from third-party licensors. If you're using third-party IP in your game, then oftentimes they also want to have some audit rights.
That's right. Yeah. Basically any license agreement, it should have an audit right in there. You really don't want to be in a situation where you have to sue somebody and start going through the discovery process in order to be able to get at that information. All of these inbound, outbound licenses, if there is a scaling payment system, a royalty is a audit right with respect to those royalties is a very common thing, and you should definitely push back on, any third party that, says we don't offer that to our partners. Minimum guarantees are a fantastic thing to get if you can get them. We're going to talk actually a tiny bit more about that when we get to marketing. I guess one cross-collateralization, so something we'll sort of point out here, publishers will often sort of want the ability to, the various things that they can, recoup. They are such as, for example, your advances, etc. They'll often try and push for being able to recoup any of those funds that you owe them from anywhere, from any of your games. The obvious problematic implication there for the developer, that makes it a little bit harder for you to cut off your losses. It makes it harder for you to have a project fail, and then all of a sudden that failed project is sucking money off of your successful project for repayment of your advance. So marketing. So, going back a little bit to what I said before about the concept of if it's not in the contract, the reality is it just may not come to fruition. There's a lot of different ways that you could be doing a licensing agreement that this is going to be relevant to. There's a lot of add-on services that, companies offer, and they'll want you to, a company like Twitch, right, will have a lot of add-on services that they may want you to put into your game. Rather than paying you for that, right, they're going to offer you things like marketing spend. So this is going to come up in a lot of sort of different ways, but the thing you want to sort of bear in mind is in all of these various ways that you're going to be negotiating with somebody where a material part of what they're offering you is marketing support, is, there's just so many ways that it doesn't show up the way you want it, if it's not really spelled out in the contract, right? People will often really kind of, be wanting to say, oh, we'll give you, $100,000 in marketing support. We'll give you $1 million in marketing support, right? Well, and then they'll send you a schedule, and that schedule will say $100,000 marketing spend. You're kind of like, what does that even mean, right? Like, what are you going to give me, right? So you want to be thinking very specifically about, not just, do I have the same view as they do about what that marketing spend looks like, right? But also, are they really going to be held down to something that you can really point to and say, you didn't deliver on this, right? And it's a very common thing for those specifics really just to not be there in the way that you think that they are. So you want to be very careful and precise about those marketing obligations. Again, if that is an important thing to you, right? I mean, sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes it's enough to just leave it at something like, they will market it consistent with the publishers of the games. That may be enough if you were talking about, a fairly small add-on service to, your app, to your game. But when you're talking about things like choosing a publisher, especially like a global publisher, if the financial support that they're offering you is that marketing support, you want to drill down on this, and you want to make sure that there's some real teeth to it. You want to think about things like, when are they going to put that money in, right? Are they going to put that money in before your game launches in the App Store so that you are going to have day one registrations? Or is it going to be something that they are kind of deciding when fits for them for it to be coming in? So you want to be talking with them and thinking about how does that strategy align with what your goals are, with what your development schedules are. Hard money versus benefits, there's just a difference. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but there's a difference between somebody saying, I'm going to spend out of pocket $100,000 marketing your game, and I'm going to give you $100,000 of time on the front page in my app store. Both of those obviously have an advantage to you, but think about, those things. If it is something where there's a dollar amount that they're supposed to be doing, try and push for it being out of pocket only, carving out overhead sorts of things. Maybe it's one thing if they have to, go out and, pay money on a third-party broker for getting marketing. That's kind of one thing. But are you as comfortable with them paying their own marketing team on a commission basis and saying, well, that subtracts out? There's an argument that those two things are very similar. There's an argument that you really shouldn't feel that those two things are similar. I mentioned before the concepts of advance and minimum guarantees, and they would kind of come back to it. Obviously, again, this goes back to leverage. It goes back to how in demand your game is, how much they want your game. But you need to think about the fact that that is a nice driver for them to push your product, right? Maybe they're picking up your game just because they want to fill a niche in their portfolio, right? Well, that's great until it turns out that niche is not looking quite as successful as they thought it was, and they're not really looking to put a whole lot of push behind you, and they're not looking to give you a whole lot of support. If they've got a minimum guarantee that they've got to pay you, a minimum royalty guarantee that is, at the end of the year, if they've got to pay you whatever, $500,000 at the end of each year, whether your game made $100,000 or whether your game made $4 million, well, they've got a lot of incentive to at least make sure your game makes $1.1 million, right, at that point, or I guess $1 million. Marketing strategy, this is something that's going to be typically left to the publisher, but it's something to be thinking about, again, back at the due diligence stage. And it's also something to be thinking about in terms of how is your game sold. There are different ways, of course, that games can be sold, and the ways that you may incorporate those into subscription services. They make a difference in terms of what those royalties should perhaps look like. Yeah.
So, in your experience with publishers, I've seen sometimes where, yes, the publisher is going to control the marketing, but with meaningful consultation with the developer, or reasonable on some basis. Have you experienced that, and have you found it to be useful?
In terms of in practice, sort of kind of how it actually plays. I mean, the in practice how it plays out, I guess I'm not going to speak to because it's probably just so company specific in terms of the relationship that people have with their publisher, right? And I think that one of the important things, for publishers, we need to recognize that not every developer even wants the same thing, right? I mean, there are some developers who are looking to just totally outsource it, right? But I think that most publishers are going into things thinking that they're going to be giving very meaningful consultation. And then sometimes, even just people, as simple as people leave, et cetera, it doesn't shake out quite that way. And I think as people who are drafting the contracts, we want to be reflective of what the business reality is, but I think we also need to be realistic and realize that, that guy who is selling that developer about what level of consultation we're going to be giving at a cocktail party at E3, that's all great, but without suggesting that you shouldn't be reflecting what the actual arrangement is between the parties. I think you as the draftsman for the publisher need to be thinking about, the realistic of, what does it mean if I write best efforts, right? It's, I don't want to say reasonable, efforts or commercially reasonable efforts, gives some sort of very clear, specific guidance. I think it probably doesn't give a lot of very clear, specific guidance. But I think it does allow a fair amount for the parties' expectations to be met. And it puts both parties, it gives both parties something to point to. So exit strategy, in some ways, I am one of those people who often believes that one of the most important things you should be thinking about when you're reviewing somebody else's paperwork, but also when you're drafting your own, but especially when you're reviewing somebody else's paperwork, is think about your exit strategy at the beginning, right? Because your exit strategy is going to determine so much of the other things that you are going to negotiate for or not, right? I mean, you can think of it as simple as, and I'm stepping a little bit away from the video game publishing agreement space here for a moment, but think of the distinction that comes up between a subscription service where you are locked into, some software as a service tool that you have locked into for a year or 3 years versus one that you have a right to walk away from at any time with a term for convenience clause. In one of those circumstances, the one where you can walk away at any time, you've got a lot of very strong extra contractual ways that you can solve a lot of problems that you have with that contract counterparty, right? At the end of the day, a lot of those things that are in the contract are nice, but the biggest teeth is, look, if you don't solve my problem, I'm taking my business someplace else, right? Switching back to the video game the video game space here, thinking about your exit strategy is still very important, right? And this does have a lot of impact on what exactly you're going to do. Think about the circumstance that you gave a third party the right to perhaps your game in a geographical jurisdiction, right? So now it's something where you're giving them maybe an exclusive territory, and you find yourself in a circumstance where, quite frankly, for whatever reason, they're not pushing the game, or their service sucks, et cetera. It just doesn't reflect what you want them to be doing. You don't really want to be in a circumstance where you have no way to get that territory back, right? And you don't want to be in a circumstance where you have no way to get that territory back before that territory is worth nothing to you. Because the user base is so fed up with the poor servers, with the other issues that they're having there, that at the end of the day, you get that territory back and you're kind of like, well, I mean, I'm just going to shut off service almost at this point. What's the point? There's nothing left. You got to be thinking about those things, and you got to be thinking about what is going to trigger your rights to get out, right? And so you need to be thinking about that throughout your contract in terms of some of your covenants, in terms of your refs and warranties, what do you need? What is it that's really going to make me feel like I have to get out of this publishing arrangement? The obvious, if there's poor sales, that's a problem. But there's a lot of reasons for poor sales, right? And you're not necessarily always going to have a circumstance where just because sales fall below a certain level, you're going to be able to terminate your contract and take that territory back. But that is a real thing. And you as a developer, if you have sufficient leverage, it's something to be thinking about. And don't be intimidated on that point, right? Because think about it from the publisher's perspective. If it's really falling below a certain threshold, well, that publisher doesn't really want to push the game either, right? So to me, I think that this is something that developers a lot of times can fall into a trap of sort of thinking like, oh, I don't have a whole lot of leverage here. This isn't just about leverage, this is also just the economic reality, right? The publisher at that point starts to care less and less about the game. And even if you don't have that right, obviously we're attorneys. I myself am a contract attorney, so I think a lot about, the contracts. But the reality is, once you're in that relationship, it doesn't mean that that's your only way to address problems, right? Both the developer and the publisher, care a lot about their reputation. They care a lot about their users. That publisher is going to have multiple games, right? And if those users are having a bad experience, that may just not turn them off to that game. It may turn them off to other games from that publisher. So even if you don't have a contractual out, if you're really having those problems, work with the publisher. It may be something that you can negotiate an amicable, end to your relationship anyway. The other sorts of issues that can come up, they're a little bit tough to negotiate things for because at the end of the day, they're difficult to really put a fine point on, right? If it turns out that your strategies are just not aligned and they're constantly pushing you to make changes to your game that you don't want to make, yes, that's a problem. And maybe extra contractually, that's something that you can sort of resolve to go your different ways, your separate ways, but it's a lot harder from a contractual standpoint to really draft something that correctly balances that, right? And the publisher is not going to just agree to something that just sort of kind of says, most likely the publisher's not going to agree to something, that has a set term, because basically any publishing agreement is going to have a certain amount of term, or else the publisher is not going to be putting the resources behind it that you want to have behind it anyway. That's going to allow you to just kind of go, you know what, I'm not really happy with the way you're doing things. So it's something to think about. Pretty difficult to really get something there. The default rights, like I mentioned, that's going to go back a lot of it to sort of how specifically you have drafted those reps and warranties, those covenants. So, you want to be thinking about, throughout your contract, those things like what does it really mean, that they're going to be providing customer support, right? Is there a way that you can demonstrate that they are not providing sufficient customer support? Transition support, like I mentioned, if you were, for example, trying to get something back, is there a way that you can get support from them to help get it back to you in one piece? So ownership, here it's going to make a big difference. Like I said, there's, in my mind, I sort of talked about the difference a little bit between a publishing arrangement and really a development arrangement where somebody has been, a publisher, for example, is paying you to make a game. In that development arrangement, that's essentially work for hire, right? This is, you are a dev shop that is making a game for somebody else. And that may be a fantastic thing, right? Maybe, you just need money, right? And maybe that's something that's worth doing, right? And you have a lot of companies that, that's what they do, right? I mean, they're a collection of devs. They don't have their own IP, and they just, do work on games for other people. And that's a perfectly fine thing. In that scenario, you're not going to own the game. In most other scenarios, it's pretty typical that the developer is going to own the game. It's really just a license to the publisher to be publishing, whether it's on their platform, whether it's in a territory, whether it's for a period of time. So, that's definitely occasionally a line that gets a little bit blurry. But if you know which side of the two you're on, it's pretty easy to make sure that it's drafted the way it should be. And again, basic, but you don't really want to overlook something as simple as who owns your game. If you don't own the game, that work for hire sort of relationship, make sure you're pushing for things like credits, right? I mean, you need that visibility, right? That's how you're getting that next customer, right? That you're going to be helping build that next game. You want to be thinking about carving out things like the pre-existing tools that you have, right? Any sort of thing that you have made beforehand, you probably are going to want to continue to own. And you may also want to think about, is there custom work you are doing on that game that you do want to continue to own, right? And these things can be negotiable. It kind of depends on the circumstance, whether or not people are really going to move on something like that, I think. But you do need to be thinking about, what is my business? What of this am I really making for somebody else, and what of this is really my business, my thing? All right, so moving from ownership to rights to future titles. So this is a very important thing to think about. A publisher is very frequently going to want rights to your future titles. If you put a game on Xbox and Microsoft wants the right to put the next game on Xbox, well, that seems a pretty easy give because I'm not going to get that game on Xbox otherwise. But you also are going to have, obviously, anybody in a territory, anybody who's a global publisher for you. They're really going to want to have rights to your sequels, right? And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of advantage to you in sticking with the same publisher as well, right? Your audience is trained to, go through that publisher, right? Your audience is trained to go to that platform, right? Your audience is looking for your game on Discord, looking for a game on Steam. So there definitely is an advantage to both sides, but you need to realize that those various rights that they're going to ask for, even if at the end of the day they can't get your game without matching somebody else's offer, that's going to have a real chilling effect on your ability to negotiate a deal with somebody else, right? If I want my game, if I want my game to be published by Tencent, and I have a, right of last offer with NetEase, well, NetEase really may not be all that interested in going through the whole process of negotiating with me, only to lose the deal at the last minute to Tencent, right? And just because of that, now they have less interest in your game, right? And the fact that they have less interest in your game means, guess what? You have less leverage, which means your financial terms are going to get worse. All your legal terms are going to get worse. Your rights are going to get worse. I don't want to sort of overstate it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, they are hoping to get your game, et cetera, but you need to realize that in any space, video games are the same as any other space. Any of these negotiation rights or rights to match offers that you give to a third party, they have a material impact on your ability to negotiate with other parties. Best case scenario for you, if you are going to give those sorts of rights, is to water it down to something like rights of first negotiation. And ROFN, that's rights of first negotiation, rights of first refusal, and rights of last offer. Rights of last offer is easily the most advantageous to the party who has that right of last offer. That's the one that basically, I have negotiated all the way through with NetEase, and at the last moment, Tencent can jump in and just say like, yep, I match that. The rights of first negotiation, that has a much, much less impact. Usually there you're talking about something like, I'm going to give you a 2-month window that I have to negotiate with you before I go to somebody else. Sometimes that's exclusive, sometimes it isn't. Again, a lot of these things will go back to leverage, yeah.
Maybe this is a stupid question. The right of last offer,
Yep.
is there an obligation to take that last offer? If they only match it, you can still go to the other one, or is that right?
Sorry, so you're saying is or the,
So you've given the publisher the right of last offer.
correct,
You go through with NetEase.
Yep.
NetEase offers you X.
yep.
Then the publisher offers you a different thing. Maybe it's more. Do you still have the obligation with the right of last offer to take the publishers, or can you still go with NetEase even though it's lower?
Oh, if they offered you less?
Yeah.
Yeah, you should definitely not agree to something where it would be, the right of last offer would allow them to give you less than the deal you negotiate with somebody else. So the right of last offer is going to be typically something where they would have to at least match the offer that's on the table.
Even if they do match it, does that? I mean, obviously, business sense would say you take the better offer, but if you wanted to get out of the agreement with the publisher, could you still go with NetEase?
Oh, so typically no. So and that would really be the point of the last offer. Most frequently, it would be you cannot do it. Occasionally, yes, you could negotiate for something which would be essentially before I sign with somebody else, I have to go in good faith negotiate with you a similar sort of deal. But I think that's less common, and at that point, you're not necessarily talking about something that is getting that publisher that much more than what they would have in a right of first negotiation circumstance, right? Because they don't have a right to the deal; they just have a right to kind of be told about the deal, and it's something that they still could be doing outside of the contract anyway, right? Both parties, right, have a lot of times an incentive to be being like, hey, by the way, I'm negotiating with somebody else, you want to get in on this, right? I mean, you, the developer, want a bidding war, right? So, as long as you have somewhat of a decent working relationship and somewhat of a, successful looking product, I, as the publisher, I think there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to get in on that bidding war anyway, at least in the circumstance that we just talked about of like somebody like NetEase and Tencent, right? Large market players where, there's some of the obvious gatekeepers into China. A little bit different if you are talking, a global publisher and you are at, a trade show talking with a whole bunch of different publishers, right? Are you going to talk to every global publisher in the world? Of course not. But yeah, most frequently, if it's a right of last offer, it's probably going to be a full-blown ability to match and take the deal. Code access, so here, this is going to go, we're sticking a little bit with our theme of ownership. You need to be very careful about what you're sharing. And again, if somebody else owns, source code is probably going to stick with whoever owns it, right? But if you are a dev shop, you need to be thinking carefully about at what point you're giving somebody source code, right? And you should be pushing and thinking about, maybe you own it, but I'm never giving you source code. That's a weird scenario, but think about it from the perspective of that dev shop wanting to ensure that they're the one who makes your game 2.0, right? That you have to go back to them to make the next one. I'm not saying that that's the norm, but these are things to think about. This is more of an issue to think about when you're really in that, work for hire dev shop sort of scenario. With respect to most publishing relationships, by the way, I mean, you're not going to be giving source code in most situations. You'd be giving, just that object code. Launch timing term. Speaking of timing, how are we doing on timing?
I think we've got about 5 minutes.
Okay. So launch timing term, I don't want to delve in deep here, but in some circumstances, this is going to be very, very important, very valuable to you, right? You want to be thinking about, are there ways that I can force the publisher to be getting this out on the timetable that I want? That may be very important to doing things like avoiding the holiday rush, right? If you're, worried that your game is just going to get crushed, in the glut of AAA games coming out or, things like that. Whether or not you can do this, again, kind of depends a little bit on your negotiating, position. how big you are, how small you are, how much they want your game, etc. You also want to be thinking a little bit in terms of coming up with from a sheer drafting standpoint, a good description of what launch really is. I've definitely seen publishing agreements that just don't describe it as well, right? They'll give an exclusive term for 3 years or whatever, right? But that 3 years goes back to lowercase l launch. You're kind of like, well, what does that mean? Launch could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, or release, etc. You want to think about really when is that starting, and you also should be thinking a little bit about what some of those incentives mean, right? If they've got your game for an exclusive period of time, maybe they're fine with us coming online in a few territories, but not all of the territories that would trigger a full-blown launch that's starting their exclusivity period. SimShip, so definitely something to think about, especially in like your console relationships. Think about, for the most part, everybody has the same interest here. You want your console, users to be all getting the game at the same time. Ideally, you probably want all of your users across all platforms to be getting updates to your game at the same time. The reality, though, is you also don't necessarily want to be in a circumstance where you have to hold up launch of your content because one of your partners is not ready to go. So it's something to think about. I think that sometimes people fall into this trap of thinking about this solely from, I, the developer, don't want to sort of be in trouble because I, breached this clause. In my mind, this is really about making sure that those publishers have to stick to your schedule, right? That they can't go, oh, yeah, we're not ready to go, you have to stop everything. And 3 weeks from now, when we're ready to go, well, everything can start moving again. No, you want to make sure that the feet is under their fire to be providing the resources they have to provide to stay on schedule, right? I gave you the content for CERT on Friday. You need to get back to me, whatever such and such date is, etc., so that we can stay on my schedule. Again, leverage, you may not be able to get this, but this is, I think, something to think about. But like I said, for the most part, interests are aligned, so I don't want to sort of overly belabor, this as a practical matter. But that's sort of some of the way that the contract really hooks up with reality. Similarly, back especially kind of in the dev shop sort of scenario, or if you have a publisher that is looking to, suggest specific types of content, etc., you want to be thinking about, the cost of making those changes. And, it may be appropriate to go through, same as you would a lot of other services agreements, pretty elaborate stuff for what a change order is, etc. Data, so I think just about every presentation, it's 2018, we're talking about data a little bit. You want to think about who owns the generated data. You want to think about what rights they have to the data that gets generated. Who gets to keep that data? What post-termination rights are there to it? This stuff is very valuable. And you also need to be thinking increasingly about things like the obligations that come with it, right? Who's responsible for some of those security things? What are you going to do with, when you get those requests to purge data from users? Or, even more onerously, when a user says, I want to get all of the information that you have on me. A lot of the large, tech companies, are trying this approach where they will just sort of publish online, the following users of us want their information deleted. And they expect their business partners to go look at that list from time to time and try and figure out, did anybody on, large company A's list ask to be deleted? All partners of large company A go look at that list, I don't know, every Friday and figure out if one of your people is on there and get them out of your records. You want to be thinking about that. I'm not suggesting that there are great solutions. I think that's sort of an area that's going to continue to evolve as we, move forward in a world that, GDPR is pushing everybody to have to do those sorts of things. Additional considerations, there's just an awful lot of ways you can monetize your IP. There's other platforms, right? And those other platforms are accretive to your game. It's a great way to make more money to, just bring your game to other platforms. But you've got other sort of things, right? Apps, movies, TV, books, comics, merch. I remember somebody telling me once, yeah, you gotta be careful about, when you guys wanna make a theme park. And I thought, well, I don't think my company's thinking about making a theme park out of any of our video games anytime soon, but there's just an awful lot of ways that you can monetize your IP, so, it's something to think about. Esports, increasingly, this is a very, valuable sort of thing. It's for quite a long time been a valuable way for a lot of games to funnel back users to the main product and grow that interest. It keeps them engaged. But increasingly it has its own value. And, I don't know that we're going to this world, but, I remember back at, some talk at some point earlier this year, somebody, was suggesting that in their mind, they don't think we're that far off from a world that, a bunch of esports companies, let's say the companies that are in Overwatch, just kind of go, hey, Blizzard, we want to buy Overwatch from you. Whether or not you agree with that theory, implicit in that idea is there's a world in that guy's view that esports becomes so valuable that they're more valuable than the original video game itself was, right? So, again, whether or not you agree with that, it's another sort of indication of kind of the value that these things have. It also goes back a little bit, like I mentioned, sort of the due diligence point about if you are looking to choose a publisher, are you looking to use a publisher that can support your esports if your game has potential as an esports title. Broadcasting, streaming, you want to be thinking about the rights to broadcast and market those events. You want to be thinking also about things like, do I want the ability to incidentally go into a territory, right? So let's say I've given, doesn't really matter, I've given South Korea to a publisher on an exclusive basis. Well, what is the effect if a user, a random person in South Korea goes online to my US-based website where I'm publishing esports of that video game? Is that me violating, the territorial restriction? I think for the most part, people understand that, that's not an intended effect. But ideally, think about it, be a little more explicit about it. You may even want to think about, does it make sense to, have some sort of simple approval right that you can address those sorts of incidental kind of things. You could have similar things with, the ability to run tournaments, etc. So you want to be thinking about those sorts of things. A couple last little things. So boilerplate, the negotiated document controls over other documents. Depending on who the publishing partner is, you don't want to be in a weird circumstance where, they have some developer's guide somewhere that somehow controls over the publisher agreement that you just negotiated, right? Those sorts of ancillary things should be more restricted to things like technical requirements, etc. That's not the place where the sort of things you're negotiating the publishing agreement should be showing up, so the publisher agreement should be controlling over those. I mentioned before the concept of merger clause in the US and a lot of other places. Typically that really sort of kind of means, look, that's great, we talked about it before now, but it didn't make its way into the contract. And a lot of times that's not going to matter. Everybody's all on the same page. Everybody's, friends. But what happens when the guy, that individual that you negotiated that deal with, he or she leaves? And all of a sudden it's not written anywhere, and you come asking for X, and the new person's saying, look, it's not that I don't believe you, but we have no budget for that, and it's not written anywhere. You got to be thinking about, those things. It's just contract basics. Amendments without formal amendment, and maybe some things, again, you want to be able to approve without a formal amendment, just to make things a little bit easier on your respective clients in terms of, how to get that, done as quickly as possible. Assignments, if you're a developer, push for non-assignable if you can. You want to stay with the publisher that you chose. You chose them for a lot of reasons that we talked about, and ideally you'll be able to stay with them. A couple last words of caution while they got really small somehow. Like I said, publishers really want what's best for their developers, and I think vice versa. But you want to bear in mind, the publisher may lack experience in your area, right? And again, that could lead to unintended consequences. It could lead to them not being able to support you the way that you want. They may have interests that conflict with yours. They may have other demands on their time, their resources. They may have a quicker hook than you, right? This game may be your only game. So it may be losing money right now, but it might be the only shot that you've got left, right? Well, maybe for that publisher it's not. And it's hard for the publisher if the KPIs aren't there to keep pouring money into something. You just need to realize your interest and theirs unfortunately can diverge. It's a marriage, it'll hopefully be a happy one, but you need to be thinking about some of those exit strategy things of, when a relationship falls apart for good or bad reasons, what then? I also do want to throw out one particular thing. If you are, for example, a very small developer, a brand new developer, please get somebody who has experience to dutifully look at your contract. There are definitely, unfortunately, some deals out there, and there's a lot of reasons why they can happen this way, right? Publishers of a very small game may not really be in a position that they can customize everything to each individual developer. So again, I'm not just bad-mouthing any particular side here, but there are a lot of times where people, when they don't know what they're doing, they'll sign things that they shouldn't have signed. I have seen publishing agreements where people have granted rights to all of their games. That probably wasn't what they had in mind. Maybe it was, right? Maybe that was all they had the leverage to get, that they had no other way to get that publisher to go with them. But you want to be very careful and think about what you're doing. And if you don't have a lot of experience with it, talk to somebody who does. It's not really the place to skimp on, not paying an advisor. And just the last couple things, at the beginning of a relationship, obviously both sides are hoping that it's all going to go great, or else they probably wouldn't be interested in pairing up. But it's easy to get those dollar signs, going in front of you on either side, and you get pressure from your business people, you get pressure from whatever to keep things moving. But you want to be thinking about the fact that this is an important negotiation. I think a lot of times people don't push as hard as they should on some of these deals, and I don't want to suggest that there is no cost to negotiating. Of course there is. If nothing else, it takes time. If you're paying somebody to negotiate for you, it takes money. But definitely, don't underestimate the importance of, those deals you were doing with other people. So that's really what I have. I don't know if there are any time for questions or not.
We're at time, but we can roll questions into the next panel.
Sounds great.
Right. Thank you.